No one announced the ending when it happened. There was no breaking headline, no dramatic cancellation notice, no public fallout loud enough to trend. Instead, it ended the most dangerous way possible in modern media, quietly. When Meghan Markle's latest Netflix project slipped out of conversation, what unsettled industry insiders wasn't failure. It was absence. No outrage. No backlash. No urgency. And in an industry that survives on attention, silence isn't neutral. Silence means the machine has already emotionally checked out. For years, Meghan existed at the center of a gravitational field. Every interview triggered response. Every appearance generated debate. Every project arrived wrapped in significance, defended aggressively by institutions that believed it mattered. But this time, something felt different almost immediately. The show appeared, existed briefly, and then began to drift. No second-wave promotion. No executive quotes explaining its importance. No desperate reframing. No sudden push across the homepage. Inside streaming platforms, projects that spark belief are protected. They're re-edited, reintroduced, repositioned. This one wasn't. Not because it was hated, but because enthusiasm had already been spent. That absence was louder than criticism ever could be. Because when a platform can no longer answer a simple question, who is this for right now? The project is already functionally over. The show didn't offend. It didn't shock. It didn't collapse under backlash. Instead, it landed at the wrong emotional temperature for the moment it entered. Viewers weren't angry enough to argue. They weren't inspired enough to defend it. So, they did the one thing algorithms cannot recover from. They scrolled. Indifference is fatal in a system built on retention. There's no controversy to optimize against, no outrage to redirect into engagement, no momentum to reframe. Just a flat line. And when that happens, platforms don't pull plugs dramatically. They pause. They delay. They stop asking what comes next. That's when the real damage begins, because once a system stops needing you to explain your work, it has already moved on. Inside Netflix, conversations shifted fast. Meetings moved on. Talking points disappeared. The project became something no one volunteered to explain. That isn't cancellation. That's disengagement. And disengagement doesn't happen because something is hated. It happens when belief evaporates. This is where royal biographer Tom Bower quietly changed the temperature of the entire conversation without ever raising his voice. He didn't accuse Meghan of lying. He didn't challenge the facts of her story. Instead, he suggested something far more destabilizing. The issue wasn't truth. It was timing. Emotional timing. Frequency. Fatigue. The emotions he implied may have been real, but they arrived with the precision of a performance rather than the unpredictability of lived experience. Viewers weren't asking whether the feelings were genuine. They were asking why they were being delivered this way at this moment with this level of polish. The stories didn't breathe. They arrived fully framed, emotionally resolved, carefully contextualized. Nothing was left unfinished for the audience to sit with. And when everything is explained, nothing lingers. Authenticity isn't measured by honesty alone. It's measured by friction, by hesitation, by moments that feel unscripted and unresolved. When vulnerability arrives too cleanly, too evenly paced, audiences instinctively pull back, not in anger, but in doubt. Vulnerability that feels instructional instead of discovered loses power fast. And once sincerity starts sounding like a thesis instead of a confession, connection weakens quietly. What many viewers couldn't articulate, but felt immediately, was exhaustion. Not betrayal. Exhaustion. A sense that they were being asked to emotionally participate in something that had already been processed, edited, and positioned for them. The emotional labor had been pre-done. There was nothing left for the audience to discover on their own. And discovery is where empathy lives. This is why the show didn't collapse publicly. It thinned. Viewership softened. Interest cooled without ceremony. Because when emotion starts to feel like part of a rollout strategy, people don't protest. They disengage. And disengagement is invisible from the outside. Contracts still exist. Relationships remain polite. Everything looks intact, but inside the machine, urgency has vanished. Decline doesn't announce itself with rejection. It arrives as administration. Emails take longer. Decisions stall. Projects stop being fast-tracked. Conversations lose momentum. Not because anyone is angry, but because attention has shifted elsewhere. In systems built on relevance, speed equals belief. And belief had clearly moved on. From the outside, everything still looked fine. From the inside, it wasn't being defended anymore. And when a project is no longer defended, its fate is already sealed. What makes this phase so unsettling is its invisibility. There's no headline for delayed replies. No article announcing evaporated enthusiasm. It all happens behind vague phrases. Let's revisit. Timing's complicated. We'll circle back. Those phrases don't sound like endings, but they are. And while this quiet disengagement was unfolding behind closed doors, something very different was happening somewhere no one expected. Somewhere without editing. Without music cues. Without narrative framing. A courtroom. That's where everything began to fracture. Not loudly, not explosively, but visibly. And once emotion surfaced there without containment, it raised a question that could no longer be ignored. If this is what unfiltered emotion looks like, what had everything else been? And that question would change how the entire story was seen. The courtroom was never supposed to be emotional. It was designed for precision, not confession. Timelines, evidence, narrow questions, controlled answers. That was the expectation when Prince Harry took the stand. What unfolded instead felt like something else entirely. Not a legal strategy, not a calculated performance, but a pressure release that had been building for years with nowhere left to go. From the moment he began speaking, it was clear this wasn't going to stay procedural. His answers carried weight that didn't belong to a single case. They sounded layered, accumulated, compressed by unresolved history finally finding a space that couldn't mute it. He wasn't just responding to questions. He was reliving them. Each answer carried the tone of someone who had been rehearsing these moments internally for a very long time, waiting for an environment where interruption wasn't possible. Observers expected arguments about evidence, timelines, and responsibility. Instead, they heard disgust, outrage, moral injury. Again and again, the focus returned to how wronged he felt, how invasive the treatment had been, how intolerable the behavior was. The courtroom didn't feel like a forum for establishing facts anymore. It felt like a place where memory was being replayed in real time. That's when the shift became impossible to ignore. Rather than addressing the questions directly, Harry returned repeatedly to emotion. Not clarification, not specificity, emotion. And in a space built for precision, emotion without containment doesn't land as persuasive. It lands as disruptive. The judge's intervention wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was calm, firm. A reminder that this was not a platform for venting. That it was not his role to express outrage or to relive personal grievance. His role was to answer the questions he was being asked. The correction landed quietly, but its implication was heavy. This wasn't about how something felt. It was about what could be demonstrated. In that moment, something cracked. Not explosively. Visibly. For the first time in a long while, the emotion wasn't packaged. There were no cutaways, no music cues, no framing language to soften interpretation. Just raw delivery landing unevenly in a space that wasn't built to hold it. Coverage shifted almost immediately. Commentary stopped focusing on legal outcomes and began circling something else entirely. The sense that this appearance wasn't really about the case. It was about unresolved history finally escaping containment. And that made the moment unsettling, not because it was inappropriate, but because it felt overdue. In contrast to the carefully curated storytelling audiences had grown used to elsewhere, this scene felt uncontrolled, unmanaged, and that difference mattered, because it raised a quiet question that followed the story from that moment forward. If this is what unfiltered emotion looks like, then what had everything else been? That question didn't arrive as accusation. It arrived as reassessment. Suddenly, previous projects were being viewed through a different lens. Not as dishonest, but as managed. Emotional moments placed where they were safest. Vulnerability expressed where it could be framed. And tension avoided where it might destabilize the narrative. Viewers didn't expect full transparency. They understand boundaries. But when a narrative promises intimacy while carefully stepping around its most destabilizing truths, trust erodes quietly. Not through outrage, but through reinterpretation. What once felt reflective began to feel selective. Not manipulative, strategic. And strategy changes how emotion is received. Across memoirs, interviews, and long-form projects, a pattern became harder to ignore. Deeply personal moments released at precise intervals. Emotional disclosures framed carefully, followed by silence until the next reveal. Nothing accidental. Nothing spontaneous. And that precision, over time, drained intimacy. People don't pull away because vulnerability is too much. They pull away when it starts to feel scheduled. When every confession feels pre-approved. When emotion arrives polished instead of hesitant. The audience doesn't feel overwhelmed. They feel managed. That management wasn't obvious at first. It took repetition to register. A rhythm formed. And once that rhythm became predictable, tension disappeared. Without tension, empathy has nothing to attach to. Stories still landed, but they didn't linger. This is where the narrative began to slide from resistance into maintenance. Not collapse. Maintenance. Sustaining a position rather than advancing it. And maintenance is exhausting to watch. Because there's no discovery, no risk, no friction. Engagement didn't vanish overnight. It thinned. Viewership softened. Interest cooled. Because when emotion starts to feel like part of a rollout, people don't argue. They disengage. And disengagement is invisible. From the outside, everything still looks intact. Contracts exist. Relationships remain polite. Appearances continue. But inside the system, urgency is gone. This is the stage most people miss. Because there's no headline for delayed replies. No announcement when enthusiasm evaporates. It all happens behind vague phrases. Let's revisit. Timing's complicated. We'll circle back. Those phrases don't sound like endings, but they are. And what makes this stage so damaging is that there's nothing to fight. No villain. No decision to appeal. No moment to rally sympathy around. Just the realization that attention has moved elsewhere. And attention, once redirected, rarely returns on demand. This is what Tom Bauer was pointing toward without dramatizing it. Not exile. Not cancellation. Detachment. A system no longer organizing itself around your presence. By the time that becomes visible, the shift is already complete. What kept audiences watching wasn't outrage anymore. It was recognition. The familiar pattern of influence thinning without conflict. Of control slipping without confrontation. Of relevance dissolving administratively rather than emotionally. That's why the story didn't end. It drifted. And drift is unsettling because it offers no resolution. No final chapter. Just continuation with less weight each time. But the courtroom moment changed something fundamental. Because it exposed what unmanaged emotion looks like in contrast to curated vulnerability. It revealed the pressure beneath the surface. The cost of containment. And once that contrast was visible, it couldn't be unseen. The story no longer belonged to those telling it. It belonged to those watching it unravel. And in that space, one final question remained unresolved, not about contracts or platforms or public opinion, but about control itself. When a narrative loses the ability to shape how it's received, what happens next? That answer wouldn't come from a streaming service. It would come from what happened after the courtroom doors closed. What happened next didn't feel like fallout. There were no emergency statements, no dramatic distancing, no visible rupture. From the outside, everything still appeared functional. Appearances continued. Politeness remained. Contracts technically existed. But inside the system, something essential had changed. The story was no longer being defended. This is the stage most people misunderstand because it doesn't look like failure. It looks like patience, like waiting, like business as usual. But inside institutions built on momentum, waiting is a verdict. When response is slow, when enthusiasm becomes procedural, when projects stop being fast-tracked and start being considered, relevance is already being reallocated elsewhere. What replaced urgency was administration. Emails that took longer to answer. Meetings that didn't quite materialize. Decisions deferred under the language of complexity. Timing is tricky. We'll revisit. Let's see how things evolve. These phrases don't sound like endings, but they function as soft closures. They are how systems disengage without confrontation. There was no singular decision to pull away, no executive moment where someone slammed a door. Instead, belief dissolved incrementally. Attention drifted. Resources were quietly reassigned. The narrative stopped being essential and became optional. And optional is fatal. This is where public perception lagged behind reality. To viewers, it still looked like visibility. Media mentions continued. Commentary persisted. But visibility isn't influence. Influence is when institutions organize themselves around you. And that had stopped happening. What made this shift so damaging was that it left nothing to fight. There was no villain to point to. No rejection letter to rally against. No injustice dramatic enough to reclaim emotional authority. Just a growing awareness that the center of gravity had moved somewhere else. Audiences sensed it before they could articulate it. Engagement didn't vanish. It cooled. Interest softened. Each new appearance carried slightly less weight than the last. Not because people were angry, but because they no longer felt addressed. The story no longer needed their participation. That's when reinterpretation set in. Past moments were revisited through a new lens, not with hostility, but with distance. What once felt confessional now felt controlled. What once felt brave now felt strategic. Not dishonest, but engineered. And engineering changes how emotion lands. People don't reject vulnerability because it's false. They reject it when it feels scheduled. When pain arrives in perfectly shaped segments. When every disclosure feels pre-contextualized, emotionally resolved, and ready for consumption. Empathy requires friction. It needs uncertainty. It needs the sense that something is being discovered in real time. When that disappears, connection thins. This wasn't unique to one figure or one couple. It reflected a broader cultural fatigue. Audiences have grown fluent in emotional presentation. They recognize when vulnerability has become content, when pain has been formatted, when sincerity arrives with polish instead of hesitation. That recognition doesn't produce outrage. It produces withdrawal. This is why the story continued without passion. People weren't watching for chaos anymore. They were watching for signal, for clues about how influence dissolves when it stops feeling organic, for what remains when control slips quietly rather than dramatically. The courtroom moment now sat at the center of that reassessment, not because it was explosive, but because it was uncontained. It showed what emotion looks like when it isn't shaped for narrative safety. And once audiences saw that contrast, everything else felt different in retrospect. The emotional authority that once guided interpretation weakened. The story stopped leading. Each new development was no longer received on its own terms. It was measured against a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, are unforgiving. What followed wasn't collapse. It was drift. And drift is unsettling because it has no resolution, no final act, no clear ending point. The story simply becomes lighter each time it reappears, carrying less gravity with every iteration. Influence doesn't disappear when people turn against you. It fades when people stop waiting, when they no longer look to you for framing, meaning, or emotional guidance. When the audience becomes observer rather than participant. That's when narratives become reactive instead of directive. Each response lands softer. Even major moments struggle to command focus. Not because they don't matter, but because the system no longer treats them as central. By the time this phase becomes visible, it's already complete. Institutions don't reverse disengagement impulsively. Once belief has moved on, it rarely returns intact. This is the modern ending no one prepares for. Not cancellation, not exile, but irrelevance managed quietly behind politeness and delay. A story that doesn't end, It just stops shaping how it's received. And that's why attention still lingers, even as passion fades. Viewers aren't invested in outcomes anymore. They're watching process, watching erosion, watching how control slips without confrontation. Because once a narrative loses its ability to define itself, it belongs to those observing it. And that is the point of no return.